So when I was in seminary, we read theologians from many different communities. And many of them had very kind of striking perspectives brought to them by kind of where their social location was, where they had come from, which community they had come from. But one particular theologian stood out in my mind as a particular challenge to wrap my mind around. And his name was Robert Allen Warrior. You notice the quote at the top of your bulletin is by him. And what he said was, we so often hold up the text of the people being liberated in Egypt from oppression, and then wandering in the desert, and then coming to the promised land, and arriving there, and finally receiving this promised land. But that we rarely talk about the people who were already living in that promised land. And he says that as a Native American, he can't read the text and feel liberated by it, because it is clear to him who he would have been in that story, that his people would have been the Canaanites. And so when he hears this story, what he sees is a story of violence and of theft, which is really hard to square yourself with, given that this is such a central text. So I carry his words with me, and when I heard the texts for today, I started to hear another voice emerging. Of course, this voice would have been an Israelite woman, and I don't know why when I speak her, she comes out with a slightly southern accent, but you're just going to have to let her do that. That's how she came to me. But this sermon is really just a reframing, a restating of the text you just heard, but with this imagined woman's voice and her experience of living this. So, it was a long time ago, a very, very long time ago. And now I'm asking you to suspend your disbelief, to set your questions off to the side, and to travel back there with me. What I can remember is that I was tired. The kind of deep hopeless that sets into your bones and makes you feel fragile and worn thin. It hadn't been a few weeks or even a few months of traveling. It had been most of my life. When we left Egypt, I was still a young woman. In those first few years after we got free, life felt full of possibility. Long after the others had given up, I was still sure that God had something beautiful in store for us. I met my husband when we were out there, and we raised up 5 children in those hot desert days and cold desert nights. But watching them grow up in the desert, never having known anything but parched lips and cracked feet, well, it eventually broke me. But even broken down, we all kept following Moses, because imperfect as he might have been, he was the only one of us who was hearing anything from God. So we learned the laws, and we lived them as best we could, all the while dreaming of wells full of clear water, and kitchens for cooking, and gardens where we could grow the vegetables our children had never even seen. And it went on like this for decades. We watched our babies grow up. We watched our bodies change. We watched our partners and our friends die. Until there were only a couple of us who could remember Egypt at all. By then, old Moses must have been well over 100 years old, and I was nearing 70. But onwards we walked, not really knowing why, but he told us that this was God's will, so we just kept going. Sometimes I couldn't imagine what not walking would feel like. That feeling of homelessness was so deep that I couldn't imagine telling my feet to stand still. After all these years, walking was the only thing we knew how to do. And that was true of most of the people, certainly all of the ones younger than me. The only skills they had pertained to wandering. How could they have learned to bake or weld while we were walking through a desert? Even if we did find a promised land, How would we know how to set up a new life? Some people, especially in the younger generation, they believed Moses had gone crazy, that he was just an old man with shaky memories of a God that only he could hear. But every time that we were sure we would just turn our backs on him and settle down on that very spot, Moses would come out with something so holy it would make you want to weep. Just before he died, he told us we were about to arrive in the promised land, that long-awaited promised land, the one I had long before given up thinking existed. But I wanted to honor the wishes of a dying man, and so onward we walked. When Moses died, that young man Joshua stepped up in his place. Because Moses had laid hands on him, he claimed he should be the next leader, that God had chosen him. Now Joshua had been born in the desert, and he longed for civilization in the way that only those who have never experienced it can. He imagined streets paved with gold, fresh bread cooling on every windowsill, and grapes that would fall right off the vines and into your hands. All the stories he'd heard as a child had been growing right up along beside him, until those stories were big, strapping tales of how good a settled life could be. His whole generation loved him, and they were ready to follow him the way we had once followed Moses. For 3 days, we waited on the muddy banks of the Jordan River. After years in the desert, I could have stayed on that bank forever, just listening to the sweet sound of water flowing by. But Joshua called us together and told us to consecrate ourselves for the miracles that would take place the following day. Like so many times before, I ritually cleaned my body and my clothes. And as I washed my garments in the Jordan, I couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to cross over the next day. Small cracks of light started to show through my hardened heart. I imagined settling into a new home with a bed and a new set of clothes, ones that weren't dyed orange from desert dust and frayed at the hems. Drying my hair in the sun, I found myself humming an old song I hadn't thought of for years before. I could hear the others readying themselves and the sounds of excited laughter further on down the banks. The next morning, consecrated, we gathered by the banks, and there Joshua began to work the crowd. He talked about how the Lord was with us. And I could tell we all really badly wanted to believe it was true. Then he started talking about how he would drive out the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, all of them off of the land. I don't know what I had imagined would happen, but as soon as I heard those words, I began to feel real fear. You see, none of these young people, not our children and not our grandchildren, had ever seen real violence. Not the kind us old-timers had witnessed when we were enslaved. They didn't know the sound of bones breaking or mothers witnessing their child's bloody death. They didn't know the sounds of gashing, slashing, ripping, raping, howling, wailing war. But I did, and my body began to ice over. But then I looked up the river and I saw that the flow was starting to slow. And then impossibly the water began to stand on its own shoulders, growing taller and taller and taller upstream. And on the other side, it began to disappear altogether. The sulfur smell of the mud flats reached up to my nose like the smell of life and death all at once. I took off my shoes and balanced them in one hand And I, like so many others, stepped into the rich, muddy ground of the Jordan. The wall of water sparkled as it caught the sun like a million tiny stars. Standing beneath it felt like being inside of God's own inhale. It was a feeling like anything was possible. I felt small and scared and strangely hopeful. We made it to the other side and built a memorial to honor this great crossing. Several days later, we dined on food stolen from the people of the land. Around a fire, I watched members of my community taste the sweetness of dates, the bitter skin of the almond, the nutty flavor of roasted grain for the first time. But despite these wonderful tastes on my tongue, I knew that by eating this stolen fare, we were taking a step away from the God who had provided for us for 40 years in the desert. When morning came, there was no manna. Troubled, I decided to take a walk, clear my mind. And I'm slow, mind you, so I have to stop often and rest. Leaned up against a rock, I heard a conversation taking place behind me. I didn't dare interrupt, so I just closed my eyes and I listened. I heard Joshua's surprised voice talking with a stranger who claimed to be the commander of the Lord's army, which sounds like a mighty important role if you ask me. But even more unbelievable, when asked whose side he was on, the stranger declared no allegiance. Instead, he simply asked that Joshua notice that the land, the ground he was standing on, was holy. Long after they left, I stood against that rock, shaking. This was holy ground, but the Lord wasn't taking sides. Whatever we were about to do to the inhabitants of the land, it was on us. God had declared impartiality and left us to behave as Moses had taught us. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet anything that belongs to thy neighbor. Thou shalt not kill. And thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, claiming God's favor when it is not so. But despite this warning from God, the same God who had just ferried us across that rushing river, that is not what we did. Even all these years later, when I think of what we did in that land, I start to feel the bile rising up in my throat. Right after it happened, I tried to tell myself that things had to go the way they did. This is just how the world works. I told myself that somebody had to win, and it was better that it was us, because at least we were God-fearing people. I told myself that justice is great in theory, but you can't hang your hat on "we are the world" or "kumbaya." I told myself it wasn't my fault. I wouldn't have chosen it if I had been involved. But yet, I still enjoyed the comforts of what we had done. I loved my new little house and the garden and the grapevines in the back. I loved my bed. I loved my clothes that someone else had made. I loved my food taken from fields that someone else's labor had planted. And I love my daily routines. I never wanted to feel that longing I had known out in the desert ever again. And what about the God who had protected me for most of my life, who had stood by me for decades of wandering? I guess I sold that God down the river for the comforts of a new land. And the more I chased that comfort feeling, the more I told myself that if I could just fix up one more room in the house, if I could just eat one more perfect meal, if I could just lose a couple fat pounds and have a few new dresses, I would finally really truly be happy, right? The more I chased that feeling, the further away I felt from God. Now, I know hindsight is 20/20, and I've had a couple millennia to gnaw on this particular bone, but I would ask that you humor an old lady and pray with me about what I wish I had known back then. God, you who is with us in our desert places, help us not to rush blindly into comfort. Sometimes we are tired, we are worn thin, we are longing for answers. Sometimes it feels like there is not enough. We look for security in the things that we can touch and taste and see. Sometimes, God, we're silent when our leaders march us into violence against some other people. We may even be uncomfortable, but we don't know how to stop it. We know that people all over the world struggle to sleep when violence defines their everyday. But sometimes we forget about the fear they must feel because the nights are peaceful here, and it's more comfortable to turn our eyes. God, sometimes we consume in ways that ignores your commandments. We steal labor from our brothers and sisters. We are complicit in unlivable wages and unjust working conditions that they experience. When we buy our food and our jewelry and our clothes, we turn our eyes from their pain because not seeing is more comfortable. We ask you today to give us the courage to open our eyes even when it is painful. God, help us to trust that by letting go of easy comfort, we will make more room for you. Fortify us so that we can live in our desert moments, walking one foot in front of the next until we reach the promised land. Maybe this time, together. Amen.